dude, this video is gonna suck, but you should watch it anyway. And good morning, amigos. This is Scotty Bones from Jalisco, Puebla. Today I'm gonna read an essay I wrote a little while ago called Albania versus Mexico. It's not really Albania versus Mexico. It's just that I was going to move to Albania a few years ago, and then I changed my mind and decided to move to Mexico instead. So these are my observations on both countries. It's not a comparison of the two countries. It's just the decisions I made when deciding whether to live in Albania or whether to live in Mexico. Albania versus Mexico. I want to talk about Albania and Mexico from the perspective of a person looking to move from the United States to a different country. I'm talking about these two countries because I came close to moving to Albania a few years ago, and I'm working on moving to Mexico right now in 2025. I'm not going to say which one I think is better or more suitable to one person or another. I'm going to talk about my experiences in each country and make some observations. Remember to take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm just a knucklehead making videos on a knucklehead platform. Also, I'm going to use the word American to signify a person from the United States. Sorry in advance to all the Americans from Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic Circle. To Albanians, American means a person from the United States. When I'm in Mexico, I refer to us as Estadounidenses. Back in 2021 and 2022, I traveled through Albania, 2 trips of 2 and 3 weeks respectively. The first trip was during the big lockdown. For me, it was the golden age of flight. Empty jumbo 747 transatlantic flights with plenty of room to stretch out. I was possibly the only tourist in Albania in April of 2021. I'm not exaggerating. I saw 2 European guys in Gjirokastër one day, but that was it. Every place I went, I was the lone tourist. Not good for business, but definitely a good occasion to observe Albanians when no one is looking. On my second trip in October 2022, there were still tourists, but still not many. The peak tourist slam came in the summer of 2024. Between the trips, I spent a lot of time reading about Albania, studying demographics, land use laws, history, food traditions, language, etc. I bought course books and began to learn Shqip, the Albanian language. It's a complex language with no close relatives on the language family tree. It's not too hard to pronounce the words, though the grammar and structure are very tough for native English speakers. That said, being able to communicate in Shqip, in Shqiperia, that's the real name of Albania, will give you a huge advantage both in communication and in goodwill. One afternoon, for example, in a little town called Uji Fëtot, which means cold water, and there are literally rivers of artesian cold water pouring from the side of the mountain there. A woman selling dried herbs and olive oil thought I was a Kosovar Albanian because of my strange accent. That made me feel a bit like an insider, even though in reality I was barely holding it together, language-wise, of course. So just speaking a small amount of Albanian will endear you greatly to Albanian people. One important thing I loved about Albania was the feeling that I got very early in my first visit. It was the absence of the pervasive rules of self-control, like those instilled in American minds. We don't need leashes because our indoctrination is so deep. I didn't feel this in Albania. Was it a different way of thinking? Or was it that Albania hadn't yet witnessed hordes of tourists falling from castle walls because there were no signs telling us to not fall from castle walls? Everywhere I went, I noticed the absence of signs and people dedicated to controlling those who have no self-control. Maybe there are no lawyer and insurance industries yet in Albania, industries that instill the culture of fear in the US and Europe. Is this part of the reaction to over 50 years of communist rule and mind wars on the people by Enver Hoxha and his party? Are Albanians just not interested in the government telling them what to do? Don't get me wrong, Albanians have self-control, but I suspect that it comes from within, from a more homogeneous culture and strong family networks that have endured invasions for thousands of years. Another thing I loved about Albania is its position within the universal cycles of growth and destruction. Europeans understand these cycles, even though they have become very weak. Americans don't understand this because we haven't even experienced one full cycle of destruction. But Albania is poised for a great cycle of growth in many different ways. Reconstruction of ruined stone buildings and villages throughout the country, the potential of depopulated villages in the south, good land and water, millennial olive trees. Of course, there are many challenges. Uncontrolled construction along the coast of the Albanian Riviera, lack of trash collection and water treatment facilities, the effects of dark money from organized crime on government corruption, the temptations of cheap money from a predatory Brussels, tribalism and corruption in the branches of government. But I can see Albania rallying around its cultural heritage, especially its language, to create a future in which tourism and technology contribute to a stable economy. The two reasons I decided not to continue with my plans to move to Albania are distance and age. I'm from the west coast of the United States. My family lives on the west coast. My parents are in their 80s. In my final assessment, I decided that the distance between Tirana, the capital of Albania, and San Francisco, the area where my parents live, was too much. I'm also almost 60 and I'm not wealthy, so traveling 13,000 miles, 3 flights over a sleepless 24 hours, to travel round trip in economy class a few times a year was a factor. But if any Albanian wants to sponsor me, I know some cool stuff about your country that could be turned into excellent long-term businesses. Every culture has blind spots that create opportunities that lie right under the people's noses. But the opportunity can only be realized if the conditions that create the blind spot are overcome. The culture of opportunity in Albania has to rise from the personal to the group level. If and when it rises to the group level, it can't be immediately captured and dragged back down to the personal level for personal benefit. Another more pertinent factor about my age was related to the nature of the plans I had in Albania. They involved creating long-term, repeatable systems rather than one-and-done deals. My observations led me to a few conclusions. I would need first to learn the Albanian language to communicate and to show willingness to reach another level. 2, I would need to learn and adapt to the Albanian culture. To the untrained mind, you can live in Albania and make observations and think you know the people and the culture, but there is a parallel reality, the real one, that functions on personal connections and family ties. I really didn't want to be just another stink-ass foreigner skimming the surface. My ideas involved entire villages and ancient trade routes and doing things in a slightly unconventional manner. But I wasn't confident that I could bridge the challenges I've just mentioned. But if I was 20 or 10 years younger, I would have definitely stayed in Albania and attempted some of these projects. Mexico. After I abandoned my Albania plans, I started looking at Mexico again. I grew up in California. I worked alongside Mexicans in landscaping and restaurants. I got a bachelor's degree in Spanish with an anthropology minor. My hometown has a large population of Mexicans, many from Michoacan. I'm very familiar with Mexican culture. That said, the idea of quote-unquote Mexican culture is not very accurate because there are many cultures within Mexico. The global picture of Mexico is mostly a streamlined synthesis of elements from central and northern Mexico. I call it the guacamole industrial complex. But there are nearly 70 languages spoken in Mexico and distinct cultures and territories in Mexico. In the United States, the conquering people had no interest in letting the indigenous people continue to exist in their native territories. In Mexico, or Nueva España, as it was known, the Spanish were brutal too. A big difference is that they did not try to remove indigenous people. Therefore, many of the ancient inhabitants still live in their traditional territories in Mexico. For many immigrants to Mexico, people who call themselves expats, a favorable exchange rate between their dollar savings and the local currency is important. It was for me in Albania, and it is for me with Mexico too. How important? Everyone has to decide for themselves. It's also worth considering what the real value of the peso is for Mexicans and what their wages and salaries are. What is the cost of living in pesos on an income made in pesos. Right now, the peso to dollar exchange rate is about 20 to 1. About a year ago, it was 17 to 1. The difference is 15%. My spending power in Mexico increased by 15%. Meanwhile, in Mexico, inflation is causing prices to rise faster than wages, like most places in the world. Prices are going up in pesos, but Mexicans don't get the exchange rate boost. For average Mexicans, nothing is a bargain in Mexico, just as nothing is a bargain for Americans in the US. Americans who consider becoming expats in certain countries and who are looking to increase their spending power with this exchange rate magic should consider whether they would still want to live in the host country if the exchange rate was unfavorable. Do you like the place enough to stay when the fairy dust magic goes away? There's a YouTube channel called Move Abroad and Thrive. It often features inexpensive houses to buy around Mérida, Yucatan. Much of the channel's focus seems to be for people in the US who are financially insecure. The channel features ways to increase spending power by moving to Mexico and taking advantage of the increased spending power of the dollar in Mexico. This model relies heavily on the dollar as the global reserve currency. If I were in this position, I would use the exchange rate advantage to buy a house, even if just a shack. Eliminate the risk of homelessness, then try to live fully within the Mexican economy. Another channel called Nomad Capitalist discusses the advantages of moving abroad that focus much less on favorable exchange rates and more on the advantages of the country's passport, tax laws, ease of doing business, etc. I consider these things as well as how affordable a place is right now. Can I hang for the long term regardless of economic changes that will ruin my plans? In conclusion, the favorable exchange rate is important to me. With this in mind, I also like to think about life in the local economy. I think about converting dollars to pesos and locking in a permanent advantage by buying a property. I also adjust my spending habits and expectations to match life in the local economy. The caretaker of the property where I stayed was low on money until payday. How low is low? He had 100 pesos to last 10 days. That's about $5. He decided to take the bus to La Gran Bodega, a discount supermarket, and buy food for the next 10 days. Round-trip bus fare was 16 pesos. That left him 84 pesos to buy food for the next 10 days. How could you or I stretch $4 for 10 days for groceries? You could get 28 of the cheapest bread rolls at 3 pesos each. That would be 2.8 rolls a day. If I drank water with a pinch of salt to go with my first bread, and then maybe foraged a few wild plants, I could make a go of it. For any potential trolls in the comments, of course I shared some food with him. The state of Puebla, where I choose to hang out, has a very strong food culture. First, it is an ancient agricultural region. Some of the oldest continuously operating tianguis, or indigenous food markets, operate in the region. The climate is mild year-round, so there is always fresh local food. The capital city of Puebla is especially known for its cuisine, a fusion of Spanish and indigenous foods. The variety and quality of street food, market food, and restaurant food is excellent. As far as being alone, I don't mind not having an expat community around me, but I haven't lived in Mexico over a long period, so maybe I would eventually desire the company of more compatriots. I spend most of my time alone anyway, reading, writing, and watching videos. A walk through town and a shopping trip to the market usually satisfy my needs for some conversation and human contact. A significant reason I chose Puebla as my base is coffee. Mexico is a major producer of coffee. It is rising as a producer of specialty coffee. Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Veracruz are the top producers of coffee by volume, and they also have excellent coffee. Puebla is an important producer also, yet receives much less attention. Puebla and the surrounding states of Hidalgo and Mexico aren't big hotspots for foreign tourists, except for Mexico City, which is partially surrounded by the state of Mexico, but not a part of it. Hidalgo has small but important coffee growing areas, and the specialty coffee scene in the capital of Pachuca is very solid and growing. And even though Veracruz is well known, there are still coffee growers and roasters doing great work, yet they're still unknown. Puebla has three main coffee growing regions: Sierra Negra, Sierra del Norte, and Sierra Nororiental. Puebla is only 2 hours from Mexico City with its large and important coffee scene, but Puebla still flies under the radar And I like that. When people ask where I'm going to in Mexico, I tell them Puebla, and they usually haven't even heard of it. Will I be guilty of making Puebla popular? That's a tall order. If this channel grows to have that kind of influence, I'll be surprised. Or will I?